Nosferatu fled across the Scottish Highlands, and Dracula followed, driven by a searing rage for the loss of his beloved Mina. Dracula's fury burns hot and reckless, exactly as Orlok, the creature known as Nosferatu, had planned. Each night had been the same, a relentless chase with no rest, no pause, only the ceaseless pursuit across frozen ground. The enraged Dracula pursues without caution. Now, beneath the looming presence of Aonach Mor's towering peak, Orlok approaches the edge of his web. A faint light glimmers through the storm, a solitary inn standing as a fragile beacon of warmth in the frozen wilderness. Orlok will feed on all who dwell within, draining them dry. With renewed power, Orlok will retreat deeper into the barren peaks, into a land where no prey lives. Dracula will follow, his strength ebbing with every step. When the hunter stumbles, weak and starved, Orlok will strike, ending the chase in a calculated triumph. But even the best-laid plans can unravel at the hands of the unforeseen. The innkeeper's cross, a small and unassuming relic, will prove a formidable obstacle. Every moment Orlok spends navigating its power brings Dracula closer. Inside the inn, the unwitting family will find themselves caught between two ancient evils. Few traveled in such weather, and with sunrise still an hour away, Angus expected no visitors. Still, his morning routine never wavered, storm or not. The inn had to be ready, not just for the rare traveler, but for his family. Once the soup simmered, a meal waiting for any who might seek shelter, he would start on breakfast. His wife and son would wake soon to join him in the morning's work, but Angus always rose first, setting the stage for the day. He stirred the pot, the rich aroma of broth and herbs filling the air, then moved to the common room. Adjusting the heavy log in the hearth, he ensured the flames burned steady and bright. The warm glow flickered across the wooden walls, their honey-colored planks darkened by smoke and time. The inn had stood for generations, built to withstand the Highland winters, its thick beams and insulated walls holding in the heat. Outside, the storm raged, snow piling against the steps and porch, the wind howling through the trees like a living thing. A sudden knock echoed, faint and uneven, as the wind battered the inn, shaking the shutters and rattling the door. Angus froze, frowning. A knock? In this storm? Most folk would rush inside unannounced, desperate for warmth. He glanced toward the door but didn't move to open it. When the sound didn't come again, he muttered, likely the wind rattle in the frame, and turned back to his task. But then it did come again, louder, more insistent. Angus stiffened, his hand pausing mid-motion. Who in their right mind would be out in this storm, and then stand waiting at an unlocked door instead of coming straight in? The thought barely settled before a third knock followed. Unease crept in as Angus recalled his grandfather's tales of spirits luring the unwary during storms. Foolishness, he told himself, yet the feeling lingered. It was well below freezing, cold enough to kill, yet whoever stood outside hadn't come in, despite the unlocked door. This was an inn. Travelers entered unannounced, even on sunny days. That they knocked at all felt wrong. His steps slowed, a chill creeping up his spine as the thought settled. Then came a voice, thin and pleading. "Please, let me in." Angus's hand hovered inches from the handle. The voice was too light, too young, almost childlike. A cold knot twisted in his gut, the unease made sharper by the echo of his grandfather's stories. The old man had filled many a stormy night with tales of spirits, clever and cruel, who took on the voices of children to fool a man into opening his door. The voice came again, softer now, mournful. "It's so cold. Please, mister." Angus rubbed at his eyes, as though the motion could wipe away the unsettling thoughts of spirits his grandfather had planted long ago. Steeling himself, he grasped the door handle. With a deep breath, he flung the door open. A blast of frigid air slammed into him, stinging his face and whipping snow into the room. He stumbled back, turning his head to shield his eyes from the icy assault. As he moved, the silver cross he always wore slipped free from beneath his shirt, swaying against his chest. Through the swirl of snow, a gaunt, deathly pale figure appeared. He made no move to enter, standing just beyond the threshold, his head bowed as if in deference, his gaze fixed on the ground. "May I enter?" the man asked, his voice low, almost a murmur. The wind howled through the open door, biting cold, lashing at Angus's face. The warmth of the inn leached away by the second, the fire behind him doing little to hold back the winter's fury. "Aye, man, aye, come in before the storm carries ye off." The man crossed the threshold with an unnerving slowness, each step unhurried, as though he were unaware of the icy wind. Snow clung to his threadbare coat, yet he didn't seem to feel the cold. Angus, on the other hand, felt the chill seeping into his bones and the icy wind cut at his skin. He wanted nothing more than to grab the man and haul him inside so he could slam the door shut. But his upbringing kept him from doing so. He stood there, enduring the biting wind, until at last the man stepped fully inside. Only then did Angus finally shut the door, sealing out the storm's fury. Angus crossed the room to the fire, moving close enough to feel its warmth radiating through him. He rubbed his chest and arms briskly, chasing away the chill. Once the worst of the cold had ebbed, he straightened and turned back to his guest, who stood motionless, showing no interest in the fire's warmth. The man kept his gaze averted, his eyes lingering on the far corner of the room, as if inspecting the shadows. Angus's unease deepened as a troubling thought surfaced. What have I let into my inn? What sort of man doesn't feel the cold? "Are there any other guests?" the stranger asked, his hollow eyes still avoiding Angus, flitting instead from the hearth to the darkened staircase. The question landed like a stone, heavy and unsettling, carrying a quiet menace that set Angus on edge. As if to answer truthfully was a mistake. Yet the answer came reflexively. Honesty was woven into him deeply, a habit as natural as breathing. "Nay," Angus said, "only me and my kin." The man's hollow eyes swept the room again, never meeting Angus's. They lingered on the hearth, the shadows, and the staircase, as if he were cataloguing every corner of the room. Angus shook his head lightly, brushing aside the unsettling thoughts creeping in, and slipped into the practiced role of an innkeeper. "I'm Angus," he said, "the keeper here. Who might ye be?" "Count Orlok," the man replied, his accent clipped and foreign, "of Carpathia." Angus's instinctive question, what would a count be doing on foot in such weather, died on his lips. "Well, Count Orlok," he said, forcing warmth into his tone, "how about some hot tea? Or a bowl of soup? You've travelled far by the looks of it." Orlok raised a hand in a slow, dismissive motion. "I require nothing." His gaze, as ever, avoided Angus, drifting instead toward the fire, the shadows, anywhere but the man before him. The wind howled across the frozen highlands, tearing through the black night with a fury that would have blinded any mortal man. But Dracula was no mere man. The storm was nothing to him. He pressed forward, undeterred, though the deep drifts of snow dragged at his steps, slowing his progress. His long cloak billowed behind him like the shadow of a bird of prey. The urge to change shape lingered at the edge of his mind, a bat to glide above the storm, or a wolf to lope through the drifts with ease. But he ignored it. Such transformations demanded energy he dared not expend. It had been days since he last fed. Ahead, past the veil of wind and snow, Aonach Moor loomed, a dark, jagged monolith. No living man could have seen it in this storm, in this blackest of nights. But Dracula saw the mountain as clearly as if the moon bathed it in silver light. It was a sentinel, an unspoken warning rising out of the highlands, and Dracula understood Orlok's purpose in leading him here at once. His gaze shifted to the inn, a distant glow against the blackened storm. Though still a mile away, his sharp eyes pierced the swirling dark with ease, picking out the faint flicker of golden light in its windows. Within its walls, warm blood still flowed, hearts still beat, the last sustenance for either of them. Beyond this place, there was nothing but snow, stone, and hunger. And Orlok, his stench was thick in the air, fouling the wind, pointing straight to He Inn. Orlok's plan was clear, to lure him deep into Aonach Moor, where the frozen desolation would do the work for him. Of the two, Orlok would be the one freshly fed, while Dracula would wither, his strength bleeding away with each passing day. Until at last, Orlok would strike. Dracula pressed on anyway. He would have his revenge. A flicker of something close to amusement crossed his mind. It was a tactic worthy of a warlord. the kind of strategy an old king might have used to starve an invading army. He had seen such methods before, when he was a living man, long before he had become something more. The memory stirred in him, flickering like embers long buried under ash. In his youth, he had stood against the Turk, held castles against sieges where supplies were cut off, watched men weaken day by day, hunger carving their faces into skulls. Orlok sought to make a siege of this hunt, to whittle Dracula down until he was nothing but a beast, too weak to fight back. A clever plan, but Orlok had underestimated him. Dracula did not fear hunger. He had known starvation before, in wars fought in the age of steel and fire, and more than that, he had patience. Real patience, not the brief patience of a creature with only a couple centuries to its name. He had waited through the slow decay of empires, outlived kings who thought themselves gods, watched the world reshape itself time and again. Did Orlok fancy himself the hunter, guiding his prey into an inescapable snare? He was nothing but a scavenger, a shadow feeding on the edges of the world, a thing that had never known battle, only retreat. Dracula had bled and burned and survived. He would survive this too. The storm raged, lashing at him, but he moved forward relentless. Angus's unease deepened with every passing second. The man's rigid posture, his hollow eyes darting across the room, and his refusal of warmth or sustenance. It all felt wrong, profoundly wrong. Angus couldn't shake the growing sense that his grandfather's tales of spirits and unnatural beings might have held more truth than he had ever given them credit for. Those stories had always been told with a wink and a smile. Yet here he was, staring at a guest who seemed more shadow than man. Regret gnawed at his chest, cold and insistent. Perhaps he'd made a mistake, letting this one in. His gaze flicked toward the staircase for a fleeting moment, where Margaret and Ewan slept soundly above, unaware of the unease curling through the common room. The silence that followed pressed down on Angus like a weight, thick and unnatural, broken only by the rhythmic crackle of the fire and the slow, deliberate ticking of the clock. He turned to the hearth, stirring the embers more for the comfort of action than necessity, his hands moving with practiced ease. Yet the warmth of the flames failed to chase away the chill at the thought he had made a grave mistake. A wave of dizziness washed over him, sudden and disorienting. He steadied himself against the mantel, his breathing uneven. At his chest, the cross he always wore felt heavy, its chain biting into his neck, as though it no longer belonged there. For a fleeting moment, the thought came unbidden. Take it off, set it aside, just for a little while. Angus clenched his jaw, shaking his head sharply as if to clear it, his hand instinctively brushing against the cross. The warm metal steadied him, grounding him in the familiar, and he forced the strange compulsion from his mind. When Angus glanced back, his unease deepened. Orlok's pale features twisted in frustration, his gaze fixed on the hearth. The man looked annoyed, almost angry, as though something unseen had failed him. Angus couldn't imagine what had caused the shift. Nothing had changed. Yet the tension in the room thickened, Orlok's disappointment palpable and unsettling. Angus shifted his stance, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. "You must extinguish all the lights," Orlok said. "What's that now?" Angus asked, turning fully to face him. "Why would I do such a thing?" "There is a man," Orlok said, his tone measured. "An evil man who hunts me. He will follow the light if he sees it. You must darken the inn. If he comes, none here will survive." His gaze flicked briefly to Angus, then away, as though weighing the impact of the words. It was as if each sentence carried a burden, spoken not from choice, but from some unseen necessity. Angus's frown deepened. "An evil man, you say? And why's he hunting ye?" Orlok's head dipped lower, his pale hands flexing before clasping together. His fingers were unusually long, their unnatural length sending a fresh wave of unease through Angus. Orlok said, "He believes I wronged him. A grudge, one that has turned to madness." Angus crossed his arms. "Well, friend, you'll forgive me if I keep the hearth burning. We'd freeze to death without it." Orlok stiffened, his gaunt frame coiled like a wire pulled taut. His shadow stretched long in the firelight, deepening as his head dipped lower. The room seemed to hold its breath. Angus's own pulse thudded in his ears, his hand twitching toward the nearest fire iron, though he wasn't sure why. Orlok's stillness stretched a beat too long, unnatural, expectant. The silence thickened, pressing in around them, the storm's distant howl the only sound. Then, from above, a scream rang out, piercing and full of terror, shattering the fragile stillness. His son, Ewan. Angus snatched the oil lamp from the table, its jittery glow casting frantic shadows as he charged up the stairs. His boots pounded heavily, but the sound was drowned out by a sharper, more desperate cry as he reached the second floor. He shoved the door open. On the bed, Ewan stood kicking wildly, his small legs striking at a writhing tide of rats swarming up the sides of the mattress. The floor seethed with them, their slick bodies darting in waves, beady eyes catching the flickering light. Clutched tight to the boy's chest, barely visible in the dim glow, was a stuffed sheep. Crude, hand-sewn, its fabric worn thin from years of being held close in sleep. His son, wild-eyed and trembling, was clutching the thing like it could protect him. Angus surged into the room, his boots sinking into the swarm with grotesque squelches and muffled pops, the sound wet and unnervingly visceral. Each step carried the slick, resistant sensation of crushed bodies, their furred forms yielding before the brittle snap of tiny bones that cracked sharply beneath his weight, as though the very floor beneath him had turned into something alive and writhing. Margaret's screams echoed through the house, frantic and desperate. Angus's stomach turned. He didn't need to see it to know the rats were swarming her too. Reaching the bed, Angus grabbed the boy and hoisted him into his arms. Ewan clung to him as they exited the room, his arms wrapped so tightly around Angus's neck it was hard to breathe. He pried Ewan's arms loose just enough to ease the pressure. The boy panicked. "Don't put me down, Dar, please." "I'm not," Angus said. "I've got you, lad, but you're choking me. Hold on, but not so tight, aye?" Ewan nodded quickly, his grip shifting but still firm, the chaos of squeals and skittering claws echoing behind them. "Now let's get to your mum." Angus bolted down the hall. The rats swarmed his ankles, their sharp teeth scrabbling at his boots, high-pitched squeals cutting through the air. The oil lamp's flickering glow sent jagged shadows leaping across the walls, twisting into warped shapes that seemed to mock his every step. He shoved the master bedroom door open with his shoulder, his breath catching at the sight inside. Margaret stood pressed into the far corner, her back flat against the wall, her hands gripping her chest as though to hold herself together. Her face was chalk white, her wide eyes darting between him and the writhing sea of rats on the floor. The creatures moved in waves, dozens, maybe hundreds, glistening with a wet sheen in the lamplight. They didn't attack her, but surrounded her, as if waiting for some unseen signal. "Angus!" she gasped, her voice trembling as it broke through her lips. "Hold tight, lass," Angus said, his tone firm even as his heart thundered in his chest. He stomped forward, each step landing with a sickening squelch. The rats swarmed his boots, their sharp teeth scraping and tugging at the leather, desperate to tear through and reach flesh. Pressing on, he reached Margaret, seized her arm and pulled her close. She clung to his sleeve, her body trembling against him. "Stay with me," he said, kicking and stomping through the writhing horde, forcing a path into the hall. The stink of damp fur and blood filled his nostrils, choking him with every step. The rats surged and scattered, some leaping at his legs in retaliation, their squeals rising in chaotic frenzy. In the hall, Margaret stood at the top of the stairs, her face pale and tense, as she glanced back toward the writhing chaos behind them. Angus had never seen her shake before. She had always been the strongest woman he'd ever known, unshaken by hardship, unflinching in the face of loss. But now, standing at the top of the stairs, her hands trembled as she gripped her arms around herself, as if she could hold in the fear. Angus, clutching Ewan tightly, tried to shove the bedroom door closed to block the swarm of rats, but after a moment of struggle, he gave up. There were simply too many, their relentless bodies pressing against the doorframe, spilling into the hall like a living tide. "Down the stairs now," Angus barked, hurrying to Margaret's side. Together they started their descent, the creaking wood beneath their hurried steps blending with the lingering sound of skittering claws above. Halfway down, Ewan gasped, his voice trembling. "Dar, look, the rats!" Angus turned sharply, raising the oil lamp high, expecting to see a seething mass of vermin chasing them down the steps. Instead, the rats had stopped. Not a single one had ventured onto the first step. They gathered at the top of the staircase in eerie silence, their slick bodies packed together like a pulsing shadow. Some perched on their hind legs, their beady eyes glinting in the lamplight as they peered down at the frightened family. None moved, none squealed. They simply watched. The unnatural stillness sent a chill through Angus, more unnerving than their frenzied attack. Margaret shivered, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as they stood halfway down the stairs. "I woke up to them crawling on me," she said, her voice thin and trembling. "Every time I tried to get out of the room, they blocked my way, biting at my feet, forcing me back to the bed." "Me too, Dar," Ewan whispered from Angus's shoulder, his small arms still wrapped tightly around his father's neck. "They wouldn't let me leave. They kept jumping at me, squeaking so loud like they were trying to trap me." Margaret nodded, her terrified eyes fixed on the silent mass of rats gathered at the top of the stairs, their beady eyes glinting in the dim light. "It's as if they were guarding us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, like they knew exactly what they were doing. "Is the devil at work tonight?" she asked. Angus adjusted his hold on Ewan, pulling the boy closer as he placed a steadying hand on Margaret's arm. Ewan clung to him, and Angus could feel his son's heartbeat against his chest, too fast, too fragile. Much too fragile, it cost a spark of icy fear to course through him. His gaze flicked up to the swarm, still unmoving, but watching them with an unnerving focus. "I don't know, love," he said, his tone firm even as dread coiled in his chest. "But we'll figure it out. First, we're getting downstairs. We'll have some soup, warm up, and wait for first light. Then I'll deal with the damn things." Only now did he notice the oppressive blackness below. He had been so consumed with getting his family away from the rats and puzzling over their strange behavior that the absence of light from downstairs hadn't registered until this moment. "Why is it so dark?" Margaret asked, her voice tight. "Have you let the fire go out?" "Must have been that fool guest, Orlok," Angus muttered, irritation rising to mask the unease creeping into his chest. "He asked me earlier to put out all the lights. I didn't, but it seems he's gone and done it himself." His words hung in the air as the faint glow of the lamp barely reached more than a step or two ahead, leaving the common room below cloaked in an unnerving blackness. As they descended the final steps, the bottom one creaked under Angus's weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The faint lamplight was swallowed by the cavernous darkness of the common room. The air was sharper here, colder, carrying a weight that seemed to seep into the bones. This wasn't the natural chill of an extinguished fire. It felt different. Wrong. Angus scanned the shadows, but the blackness revealed nothing. Each breath felt heavier, as though the room itself pressed in on them. Margaret stumbled on the last step, bumping into Angus. The lamp slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor. Angus cursed as a small flame sparked to life, quickly spreading across the spilled oil and licking at the edge of the rug. "Confound it," Angus said, setting Ewan down and stomping at the growing fire, his focus narrowing to the task. "Margaret, watch the boy," he began, but the words stopped in his throat. She wasn't behind him. Angus finished stamping out the fire before peering into the darkness, trying to make out his wife's shape. "Margaret, where did you go, lass?" Angus reached blindly into the darkness, his fingers grasping at empty air where she should have been. The absence of her presence hit him with a weight that felt too familiar. Too much like the night he lost his father, the same hollowness that came when his mother took her last breath. That brief, aching moment where the mind refuses to accept what the heart already knows. He forced the thought away, but for that one terrible instant it felt like she was gone forever. "Someone took her, Dar," Ewan whispered, trembling. Angus couldn't see the boy's face, but he knew tears were streaming down it. He placed a hand on Ewan's head. "She's fine," Angus said, though the words rang hollow. He wanted them to be true, needed them to be. Ewan clutched his stuffed sheep tighter. Angus couldn't see him in the dark, but he imagined it. Recalling the night the boy had crept into their room after a bad dream, clutching the same toy just as tightly. Now, in the pressing blackness, Angus felt him nod against his leg, small and shaking, clinging to the unshaken belief that his father could make everything right. He called out louder, "Margaret! Sing out, lass! You're worrying the boy!" Then, when no answer came, "Count Orlok, is this your doing? Some game you're playing at? If this is you, I'll break your head." The silence that followed pressed in like the weight of the storm outside, heavy and absolute. Even the faint creaks of the inn seemed to fade, leaving an unnatural stillness that clawed at Angus's nerves. His breath felt too loud in the void, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then it came, a wet, grotesque noise from the shadows ahead, faint but unmistakable, a sickening slurp like someone greedily emptying a bowl of soup. Angus's stomach twisted. The sound stirred a storm of fear and rage deep inside him, the urge to fight warring with the primal instinct to run. The storm roared through the highlands, the wind shrieking across the frozen land, but Dracula stood unmoved. Several yards from the inn, he remained shrouded in the swirling dark, a shadow within shadows. Snow lashed at his long cloak, wind howling through the trees, but he barely felt it. His sharp eyes fixed on the building ahead. The light downstairs had gone out some time ago, not the work of the storm. No, this was Orlok. Drown them in darkness, strip them of comfort, weaken them before the kill. The beast's tactics were crude, but effective against fragile human minds. Dracula's presence was veiled, held back at this distance, far enough that Orlok's feeble abilities would not detect him. He remained still, watching, calculating. Then, without a sound, he reached forth with his mind. His consciousness drifted over the inn like a phantom, pressing against its walls, searching. Upstairs, the rooms lay empty, no sleeping minds to latch onto, no drowsy souls to whisper a simple command. "Rise, invite me in." Nothing. The only life pulsed below. Dracula pushed deeper. A tangle of emotions crashed against him: fear, anguish, the sharp sting of pain. Terror choked the air within. The mortals were awake, fighting, struggling, and Orlok, feeding. Dracula inhaled slowly, his hunger sharpening as the rich coppery scent of fresh blood carried through the ether. It was intoxicating, thick and warm, stirring an ache deep in his hollow gut. The stench of Orlok still tainted it, foul, greedy, but beneath that, the blood itself was pure, unspoiled, delicious. The beast had wasted no time, but something else burned against his probing mind, something sharp and bright. A cross. The presence of it flared strong and unwavering, a holy barrier between Orlok and complete domination of the inn. Dracula withdrew slightly, assessing. The crossbearer complicated things. No open windows, no weak minds left unattended. He could not slip inside like mist, nor wrap his will around the living and bend them to his purpose. Orlok was little more than a beast. If the crossbearer understood the strength of what he held, the balance could shift. Dracula would wait, watching, measuring each possibility before making his next move. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over Angus, brief but unnatural. He steadied himself, blinking hard, and felt something shift. His fear didn't vanish, but it dulled, smoothed over like a blade losing its edge. The weight of it all, the horror, the grief, it should have been crushing, but instead it settled into something distant, manageable. Maybe it was his own mind shielding him, forcing him forward. Or maybe... No, it wasn't right. It wasn't natural, but he couldn't afford to question it now. "Margaret," Angus called again, his voice rising, unable to mask the edge of fear. Ewan whimpered softly, pressing into his side. Angus placed a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder. "Come on, lad," he murmured, guiding them toward the shelf where the matches and candles were stored. Ewan tugged at his sleeve. "Da, carry me," he whispered, his voice small, trembling. "No, lad," Angus said, keeping his voice steady. "I need you on your feet. If I carry you, I might stumble, then we'd both hit the floor." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the real reason either. He needed his hands free in case Orlok came at them from the dark. Instead, he reached down, found the boy's hand, and took it. Ewan gripped back tightly, his small fingers clinging to his father's. Angus gave a reassuring squeeze, but kept his own hold light, firm enough to steady the boy, loose enough to let go in an instant if he had to. The slurping sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse, oppressive, watchful. His free hand drifted to his chest, fingers closing around the small cross beneath his shirt as he offered a silent prayer for his family's safety and that he was wrong about Count Orlok. Let the man be nothing more than a man, some fool playing at shadows. Because if he wasn't, then light alone might not be enough to face what waited in the dark. "Stay close, lad," he said. Holding Ewan securely at his side, Angus advanced with measured steps, every sense sharpened against the unseen threat. His free hand brushed the edges of the long breakfast table, fingers ghosting over the rough wood and the chairs surrounding it. He mapped the space by memory, each familiar contour guiding him forward. The shelf he sought stood just beyond the table's left side, only a few more steps. Keeping that in mind, he moved steadily, his breath slow and controlled, ready for whatever waited beyond the veil of blackness. When his fingers found the shelf, his stomach dropped. He traced the smooth wood, searching every inch of its surface. Empty. A sudden burst of white-hot anger flared inside him, warming his face and neck. His fingers curled into a fist before he forced them open, his breath coming rough through his nose. "Count Orlok," Angus said. "What game are you playing? Where is my wife? I'll kill you if she's hurt." The only response was the wind howling against the inn, the faint creaks of the old wood, and Ewan's soft whimper. Nothing else. Angus's gut churned, dread clawing at him. If Orlok had Margaret, there should be a sound. Her breathing, the shuffle of feet, something. But there was only silence. A fresh surge of rage coursed through him, his grip tightening around Ewan as his jaw clenched. He wanted to find the shotgun, to do away with Orlok and whatever cruel game he was playing. The Count had stolen their light, left them fumbling in the dark like prey. Angus swore that as soon as he could see, he would make Orlok regret it. Grabbing the shotgun in the back of the inn had always been part of the plan. The thought flashing hot and insistent. Deal with Orlok, end whatever this was. But light had to come first. Without it, the gun was a danger in his own hands. He'd be firing blind, unable to see the man, unable to see Margaret. What if she was in the way? What if she was being used as a shield? Why couldn't he hear anything? Had she been knocked out, choked until she lost consciousness? His thoughts spiraled darker, dragging him toward places he refused to go. No, he had heard no struggle, no cry of pain, only silence. And silence was worse. The unknown twisted in his gut, every possibility gnawing at him. None of it made sense. The darkness pressed in, thick and smothering, swallowing reason as a deeper, more urgent need took hold. To bring light to the room, to see what had become of her. "To the hearth," he muttered. "We've got more matches there. We'll get the fire going. Can't let this place turn into an icebox." "Yes, sir," came his son's small voice at his hip. Together they moved cautiously, Angus's free hand finding the dining table again, then trailing along the table's edge, using it as a guide. Step by step, he navigated its length, feeling the sturdy wood beneath his fingers until he reached the middle. From there, he turned, moving straight away from it, knowing nothing stood between the table and the fireplace, so there was no danger of tripping. His fingers found the stone mantel, and Angus sagged with relief. He reached up, hands sweeping across the rough surface, searching, only to find it bare. No matchbox, no stray candle, nothing. A fresh surge of anger and fear coursed through him. Orlok, the bastard had taken even this. A light flared against his chest. Angus glanced down to see his cross glowing. Out of the darkness, a monstrous face emerged, snarling, fangs bared, long fingers reaching out. Ewan was yanked from his side, and then both figures, monster and boy, vanished into the black, the cross's glow snapping out. "Ewan!" Angus's voice cracked with desperation as he surged forward, hands outstretched, grasping wildly at the air. But the boy was gone, pulled deeper into the blackness. Angus stumbled, the cold biting into his skin as he moved blindly. "Ewan!" he shouted again, raw with panic. His boots scraped against the stone floor as he groped for something, anything to hold on to. He clawed at the empty void, his fingers finding nothing but icy air pressing in from all sides. His heart thundered as he stilled, listening desperately for any sign of his son. The inn creaked faintly under the storm's weight outside, but within there was only stillness. The silence was worse than any scream, a chilling void that swallowed every sound except the frantic hammering of his own heartbeat. The cross beneath Angus's shirt began to glow again, faint but steady, casting a dim light into the oppressive darkness. He yanked it free, clutching the pendant with trembling fingers and holding it out before him, more shield than lamp. The glow brightened as he stumbled forward, shadows flickering against the walls and floor. "Ewan!" Angus's voice cracked, raw and desperate, piercing through the suffocating void. A soft whimper answered him from the far corner of the room, barely audible. The cross's faint light flickered across a shape, hunched and grotesquely wrong. Orlok loomed in the shadows, his skeletal frame wrapped around Ewan, whose small body trembled in his long, claw-like hands. Angus's breath caught as the glow illuminated crimson smeared across Orlok's mouth, glistening wetly. Blood, Margaret's blood. His knees nearly gave way as his gaze dropped to the crumpled form at Orlok's feet. Margaret lay unnaturally still, her face drained of life. The sight hollowed Angus, twisting his stomach violently. His wife, gone. His son, captive. His home, turned into a nightmare. Rage flared hot and immediate, but icy fear followed. His mind raced for understanding, but the memory of his grandfather's old fireside tales rose unbidden. Stories of vampires, cursed creatures feeding on the living. Angus had laughed back then, treating the tales as harmless fancy. But now, staring at Orlok's sunken eyes and blood-slicked lips, the truth settled in his gut like a stone. This wasn't a wandering madman, this was a vampire. The stories had been warnings, not whims. He stepped closer. The cross's glow grew brighter in Angus's hand, forcing Orlok to recoil slightly. The vampire's grip on Ewan loosened, but only for an instant. Angus's knuckles whitened as he stepped forward again, voice trembling but resolute. "Let him go." Orlok's sunken eyes fixed on him, burning with malevolence. The light from the cross seared his pallid skin, but Angus pressed forward one step closer. "Put him down," Angus demanded, voice shaking. The cross's glow intensified the closer he got to the vampire. "Let my boy go, you dirty bastard." Orlok's lips curled back, exposing blood-stained teeth. "Stay back, innkeeper," he said. "One more step, and I snap his neck." Angus stilled, breath catching. Ewan whimpered, his small body trembling in Orlok's grasp. "Put him down, or I swear I'll—" "You'll what, innkeeper?" Orlok sneered, his gaunt face twisting with feral malice. "I hold your boy's life in my hands. Now step back and rid yourself of that thing." Angus didn't move. "Whatever you want, let my boy go and we'll talk." Orlok's lips curled with disdain. "Dracula is near, and your meddling has squandered my time. Cast aside the relic, innkeeper. I require you, not the whelp I hold. He is nothing, but you." His gaze burned. "Abandon the trinket, and I will spare the boy." Angus's jaw tightened as he held the cross higher. Orlok flinched, the tension in his gaunt frame betraying the pain. "It hurts, doesn't it?" Angus said, his voice hardening. "You can't stand it." He stepped closer, eyes locked on Ewan's tear-streaked face. Orlok hissed, baring his teeth, but Angus pressed forward, driving him back until his skeletal frame was pinned against the corner. The cross burned brighter, its glow forcing Orlok into the wall like a nail. Orlok's face twisted in pain, but in one sudden chilling motion, he shifted his grip on Ewan, pressing a clawed finger to the boy's neck. A thin line of blood trickled down, vivid even in the dim glow. "Stop," Orlok rasped. "Another step, and his blood will flow like a river." "Don't hurt him," Angus said, voice trembling but firm. "Then do as I say," Orlok hissed. "Back away and lower that relic, or I'll leave you with nothing but a corpse to cradle." Angus hesitated, his grip firm as the cross trembled in his hand. "Let him go first." Orlok's sneer deepened, mocking. "You'll bargain with me? Foolish man. I decide who lives and dies here, not you. Now step back, or I'll remind you why your kind fears the dark." Angus took a halting step back, his jaw clenched tight, the cross glowing faintly as jagged shadows danced across the room. His mind raced, searching for any way to break the stalemate. Orlok's claws pressed tighter against Ewan's neck, the boy's soft whimpers breaking through the silence. "Throw it into the hearth, innkeeper," Orlok commanded. "No," Angus said. "You'll kill us both. I know it." "I kill your boy now if you don't," Orlok said. Angus's lifted the cross higher. "Then it'll be just me, you, and this." He shook the cross toward the vampire, anger boiling over. "What happens if I press it to your skin? Will it burn? Harm my boy, and I'll drive this into your eye." Orlok spat at the floor, his lip curling into a sneer. For a tense moment he said nothing, his sunken eyes gleaming with unreadable malice. "I can't harm you while you hold that relic," Orlok said finally, "but they can." Angus frowned, confusion flickering across his face as a new sound reached his ears, a faint rhythmic scurrying. It grew louder, coming from behind him, unmistakably from the staircase. His stomach sank. The rats. The noise swelled, a relentless tide of tiny claws against the wooden steps, before exploding into a chaotic frenzy around him. Though the cross lit only the immediate area, Angus didn't need to see them to feel the swarm pour into the room. Their high-pitched squeals rose in a deafening chorus, surging toward him like a living tide. Angus swung the cross wildly, its faint light illuminating the chaos at his feet. He could see them now, matted fur, beady eyes gleaming like sparks in the dim glow. They clawed and bit, sharp teeth tearing into his ankles and calves, finding every vulnerable spot. Pain flared hot, but Angus stamped harder, his boots crunching into the writhing mass. Blood soaked through his trousers, but the rats pressed on. His fury warred with fear as he lashed out, desperate to hold his ground. The cross trembled in his grip, its light keeping Orlok pinned as the chaos surged around him. He dared not move too far. If the light faltered for even a moment, Orlok would vanish into the darkness with Ewan, or worse. The scurrying grew deafening, a maddening cacophony of claws scraping against wood and stone. Angus swung the cross wildly, its faint light barely illuminating the chaos at his feet. The rats surged forward, a relentless tide of filth and fur, their high-pitched squeals slicing through the suffocating darkness. In the dim glow, Angus could see them clearly, slick, matted bodies swarming his boots, their beady eyes glinting with malice. Teeth and claws tore into his flesh, ripping through his trousers and sinking into his calves. Pain seared through him as blood seeped down his legs, pooling in his boots and mingling with the gore beneath his feet. He stomped savagely, his boots crunching through the writhing mass, the sickening sound of crushed bone mixing with their frantic squeals. They pressed on, clawing higher, some reaching his knees. Angus swung his free hand, knocking them away as more latched onto his boots. Each bite sent sharp jolts of pain tearing up his legs, but he refused to stop. His breath came in ragged gasps as he fought to stay close to Orlok. If he moved, even for an instant, the vampire could vanish into the darkness with Ewan, or worse, tear the boy apart. The cross trembled in his grip, its glow casting jagged shadows over Orlok, whose grip on Ewan remained firm, his sneer unbroken. The biting stopped all at once. The rats scurried away, retreating into the darkness as swiftly as they had come. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the shadows themselves were alive and watching. Angus's eyes darted to Orlok, suspicion flaring hot in his chest. He must have sent them away, Angus thought, readying a new threat. Perhaps he would promise their return, or worse, unless Angus threw the cross away. But then he noticed Orlok's sunken eyes were not on him. They stared past him, fixed intently toward the dark, toward the front door. A cold dread rippled through Angus. He turned back to Orlok just as the vampire's lips parted, his voice a low, rasping whisper. "He's here." A knock came, sharp and deliberate, echoing through the room. Angus froze, his heart slamming against his ribs, his breathing heavy. "Do not open it," Orlok hissed. "Whatever you do, do not invite him in." The knock came again, louder, sharper, with a deliberate rhythm. Then, slicing cleanly through the storm, came a voice. "Good evening." Calm, polite, and cultured, the words shouldn't have carried over the roar of the wind, yet every syllable was clear. "You've had quite the night. I smell so much blood. the man continued, his tone conversational but curling with something sinister, like smoke licking at the edges of a flame. "I assure you your troubles are over now." I can hear him so clearly, Angus thought, the realization creeping over him like frost. Just like Orlok. When Orlok had first knocked on the inn's door, the storm hadn't muted his voice either. Each word had cut cleanly through the chaos, as if he were standing mere inches away. Now this voice carried the same unsettling clarity, the same defiance of the natural world. Angus's lips parted, but no sound escaped. The understanding slammed into him. Whoever, whatever, stood at the door wasn't human. It was like Orlok, unholy, a vampire. "Invite me in," the voice commanded, smooth and compelling, "and I will rid you of your pest. Your boy will be safe. You have my word." Angus's eyes darted to Ewan, still held tight in Orlok's claw-like grip, his tear-streaked face trembling with terror. A question seared through Angus's mind. How did the man outside know? Was he watching? His gaze flicked toward the window, though he couldn't see it from where he stood. Even if he could, he knew the glass would be coated in frost, thick and blinding, making it impossible to peer inside. "Lies," Orlok rasped, his voice sharp with venom. "Every word drips with deceit. Invite him in, and you'll find no bargain kept. I offer you this, one last time. Cast aside the cross, give yourself to me, and the boy will be spared." "And yet," the voice countered, calm and cutting, "he's the one holding your child hostage. Consider that, innkeeper. My quarrel is not with you." Angus's throat tightened, and he forced out the question. "Who are you?" "I am Dracula." Orlok's sunken eyes gleamed with urgency. "Listen to me," he rasped. "The man beyond that door is the devil I warned you of. His lies are sweet as honey, but they will choke you just the same." "And what are you?" Angus snarled, his voice raw with fury. "You killed my wife, threatened my boy, and now you want to act the savior. You're no different. You're a vampire." He turned his head and spat into the darkness, the contempt in his gesture sharp and final. "If the deer could talk, what would they call you?" Orlok countered, his tone biting. "Would they not run in fear, knowing you kill to live? And why? Because you must eat to survive. So must I. Blood is my only sustenance. Do you think I chose this curse?" His voice dropped, hollow and bitter. "I did not." Angus gripped the cross tighter, the faint glow trembling. "You've cursed yourself, and now you curse us." "I curse no one," Orlok said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I am warning you. He can do nothing without your invitation, but if you give it, you doom your boy. I offer to spare him. You think me cruel? You cannot begin to imagine cruelty until you face what waits at that door." The voice outside came again, calm and deliberate, slicing through the storm's roar with unnatural clarity. "Do you hear him, innkeeper?" it asked. The desperation in his voice. "He lies to save his own wretched skin. Look at the child in his grasp. Does that look like sparing to you?" Angus's knees faltered, the cross trembling in his white-knuckled grip. The cultured tone carried a chilling resonance, bypassing reason and settling deep in his chest, heavy and insidious. "Invite me in," the voice continued, "and I will end this for you. The creature before you will harm your boy no further. I swear it." Angus's breath hitched, the words dangling in the air like bait. There was a pull to them, a weight that almost felt sincere. But in the faint light of the cross, Orlok's snarling face flashed, anchoring Angus in his doubt. "Lies," Orlok spat, his voice venomous. "All lies. He coats your ears in honey." A new sound broke the heavy silence, the faint, deliberate scrape of something sharp against glass. It came from the window near the front door, slow and methodical, grating against his nerves. He couldn't see it, but he knew Dracula must be clearing the frost to peer inside. The scraping stopped, followed by a low, chilling laugh. Then came Dracula's voice, silky smooth, curling into the room like smoke. "It's as I suspected. You have him trapped, innkeeper. You have power over him. Don't let him tell you otherwise." Another scraping sound began, this time from a different window. Angus's stomach twisted as he imagined Dracula's pale hands, steady and purposeful, brushing away the snow and frost. The noise stopped again, and Dracula's voice returned, tinged with something that almost sounded like regret. "I had hoped I was wrong," he said, his tone soft yet cutting, "but now I see he has killed your wife. Had I arrived sooner, perhaps she could have been spared." The words struck Angus like a hammer. His throat tightened, his chest aching as the image of Margaret burned fresh in his mind. Her body lay somewhere to his left, hidden in the darkness, beyond the faint glow of the cross. Tears streaked Ewan's face as he trembled in Orlok's grasp, his small body racked with silent sobs. Grief and fury churned in Angus, raw and suffocating. "He cares nothing for your pain, Angus," Orlok hissed, his voice laced with venom. "Do not be fooled. He has swum in an ocean of blood. Your woman means nothing to him, no matter what lies drip from his tongue. He has no heart to feel anything." Dracula's voice cut through, colder now but no less steady. "Is that so, Orlok? Then why are we here? Whose name have I sworn to speak as I end your miserable existence?" The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, broken only by the wind clawing at the inn. Angus's fought to see some way out of the impossible horror closing in around him. Dracula's voice softened, taking on a measured, almost mournful tone. "Innkeeper, I swear to you on the soul of my Mina that I will help you if you invite me in. No further harm will come to your boy, or to you. And to show you what her name means to me, I will tell you her story." The words settled over Angus, heavy and unyielding. Grief for Margaret and the terror for Ewan warred with his fear of trusting another monster. Dracula began to speak again, his voice rich and resonant, weaving a tale of love lost and vengeance sworn. "She was unlike any other," he began, his tone carrying a sorrow that sent a shiver through Angus. "Wilhelmina Murray, my Mina. Her beauty was not merely of the flesh, though her countenance could have softened the hearts of even the cruelest men. It was her kindness, her unwavering grace, that made her a light in the shadowed world I have inhabited for centuries." Dracula's words, heavy with grief, twisted inside Angus. He wanted to dismiss the voice as pure malice cloaked in sorrow, but the weight of the tale stirred something too human to ignore. He didn't dare trust it, yet the rawness made him pause. "She was light itself," Dracula continued, his voice softening, though steel edged each syllable. "And such light does not go unnoticed. Another saw it, Count Orlok. But where I approached with care, he came like the vermin he commands, crawling, grotesque and unwelcome. She recoiled from him as any mortal would, his very presence a mockery o' her purity." Orlok sneered. "Do not pretend she looked upon you without fear. You may cloak yourself in silks and civility, but you are no less monstrous than I." Dracula's tone didn't waver. "Aye, she feared what I was at first. Any mortal would. But she saw past it, saw what you could never show her, because there was nothing in you to see." Orlok bared his teeth. "You speak of care and grace, yet you would have torn me apart for daring to desire her. Tell the innkeeper how you raged, how you thirsted for my blood." "And you," Dracula snapped, his voice hard as steel, "left a dead bird at her feet, twisted and adorned with weeds like a grotesque offering. You could not woo her, Orlok, so you sought to frighten her. The rats at your heels, the stench of death you carry, it was all you ever had to offer." The storm outside howled, rattling the windows as if in agreement. The cross glow trembling faintly, the tension between the two creatures pressing into the room like a weight. "You claim love, yet it was possession," Dracula continued, his words dripping with disdain. "She wanted nothing of you. She pitied you." "Pity," Orlok spat, his voice seething. "And what did she feel for you? Perhaps she believed herself noble, granting a cursed creature her company." "She was light itself," Dracula said again, his voice low and heavy, as though speaking to himself now. "And you, Orlok, are nothing but a shadow, a crude mimicry of greatness, a shoddy counterfeit made by unskilled hands. Your very existence is an insult to her memory." Angus's heart pounded as the air thickened, the storm outside seeming to echo the violence brewing within. He could feel the weight of both vampires' hatred, their words cutting like blades in the dark. Dracula's tone softened, becoming almost wistful. Mina and I shared a bond unlike any I have known in my long existence. She saw me for what I am, but she did not recoil. She did not flee. Instead, she looked past the shadow and found something in me even I believed lost. A soul. She was no mere conquest, no fleeting obsession. We grew closer with every passing night. Angus felt the cross grow heavier in his hand, its faint glow trembling like his resolve. The words didn't belong to a monster. They carried the weight of a man's grief, of love lost and still mourned. It unnerved him, made him question the lines between man and monster. "Think you can best me this way?" Orlok asked. "We shall see who is the stronger. Drip your honey. Yes, we will see. We will see who lives and dies." Angus shifted the cross in his hand, unease settling deep in his gut. Orlok's response felt disconnected, as if he were answering something unspoken. The weight in the room had changed, thick, pressing, as though the very air carried tension he couldn't see. Dracula's voice carried on, steady, sorrowful, but beneath it, something else churned. Angus didn't know how he knew, but he did. The battle between these two had already begun. Dracula continued as though Orlok had said nothing, his voice dipping lower. But Orlok could not abide what we shared. His envy consumed him, his grotesque attempts to win Mina's affection growing more desperate by the day. One night I found him lurking in her garden under the cover of darkness. He had brought her a gift, one of his vile creations, a dead bird he had crudely adorned with wildflowers. Angus's stomach churned at the image, the grotesque parody of affection as unsettling as the tale itself. He glanced toward the dark corner where Orlok crouched with Ewan, the boy's quiet sniffles barely audible over the storm's muted wails. Orlok's sunken eyes gleamed in the dim light, and Angus couldn't suppress the revulsion twisting his gut. Dracula's voice deepened, a low growl vibrating through the air like distant thunder. I nearly ended him there. My rage was such that I would have torn him limb from limb. But Mina begged me to stop. "You are not like him," she said. "You are better." His words faltered, the silence heavy with something unspoken, something raw. For her, I let him live. For her, I showed mercy. Angus's knuckles hurt. He gripped the cross so tight as he wrestled with the conflicting emotions roiling inside him. Mercy, from something like this. It felt impossible. Yet the pain in Dracula's voice, the naked, unguarded pain, made Angus question everything. Whatever this thing was, it had loved. It had suffered loss. Orlok had gone still. Too still. His sunken eyes, once gleaming with malice, had dulled, blank and unfocused, as if he were asleep standing upright. The icy wind howled through the cave, snow swirling at the entrance like pale ghosts dancing in the dark. Orlok crouched in the shadows, his gaunt form blending into the jagged contours of the stone. The vast expanse of the frozen highlands stretched beyond, white and lifeless under the storm's relentless assault. He had chosen this place well, far from the warmth of villages, far from the blood that sustained creatures like them. Dracula was close now. Orlok could feel his presence, a faint and fraying thread in the abyss of night. Weak, ragged, inevitable. The storm had done its work. It had whittled Dracula down, each gust peeling away his strength like flesh from bone. There was no prey in these mountains, no life to nourish him. Only Orlok, the patient spider waiting at the heart of his web. Dracula would crawl into the cave, starving, desperate, and easy to kill. Orlok allowed himself a flicker of satisfaction, a dry smile curling his thin lips. He had calculated every step, driven Dracula into this barren expanse, and now the end was near. Orlok traced his claws over the stone floor, the rough texture grounding him in the moment. This was how a hunter triumphed, not through brute strength or blind rage, but through patience and cunning. Dracula might have been the king of his domains, a predator that humans whispered of in fear, but here, in this wasteland of ice and shadow, Orlok was the master. A sudden gust of wind roared through the cave, whipping Orlok's long coat into the air. The fabric flared behind him like a shadowed cape, snapping and twisting in the gale. If he had hair, it would have been plastered to his skull by the biting draft, but the wind only whistled through the hollows of his gaunt frame. Orlok's eyes flicked to the coat, flapping and twisting in the relentless breeze. He tilted his head, turning one way, then the other, watching the freezing Arctic blast ruffling the fabric. Only Orlok felt nothing of the freezing wind, no sting against his skin, no chill in the air. In fact, the cave felt warm, far too warm for a place that should be deathly cold. The faint smile on his lips vanished. A deep frown took its place, tightening into a snarl. He stiffened. "Dracula." The voice came, from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You see it now, don't you?" "Tricks," Orlok said. "Illusions, glamour." "A strategy," Dracula said, "and a necessary one." The vampire materialized from thin air. Orlok said, "But you forgot something. My body still stands in that warm inn. Putting me here, in a cave that must surely be many degrees below zero, was a mistake." The dapperly dressed vampire shrugged. Though locked in this mental clash, their bodies remained in the real world. Dracula stood at the window, his gaze steady as he spoke of Mina. Orlok's gaunt form held the boy hostage, his lip curling as he responded with venomous remarks. The conversation unfolded with an unsettling calm, neither betraying the vicious war raging within their minds. Count Orlok said, "You're a fool." "It's only a matter of choosing wisely," Dracula said. "This one failed. Perhaps the next." Orlok snarled, his claws scraping the stone. "Soon your mind will be mush." Orlok unleashed his psychic power, not at the illusion of Dracula before him, but across the inn where his body stood locked in place. His force crashed outward, invisible and violent, slamming toward Dracula's presence at the window like a storm of jagged shadows. Yet still, Orlok remained within the illusion. The cave trembled, its walls rippling as the snow froze mid-swirling gust, hanging in the air before shattering into shards of nothingness. Orlok pressed harder, his will coiling and striking like a serpent, the sheer weight of it threatening to crush Dracula. But the vampire held firm. The illusion flickered back into shape, only for the walls to crack and melt a moment later. Dracula said, "But brute strength only goes so far. You burn hot, Orlok, but I can endure." Orlok ripped at the edges of the illusion, forcing it to collapse completely into darkness. Dracula faltered, the strain creeping into his thoughts. Satisfaction swelled in Orlok's chest. He pressed harder, certain the tide had turned. "You've shown your strength, Orlok, but strength alone crumbles without purpose," Dracula said. "I fight not merely to survive, I fight for her, justice for my Mina." The void stabilized. Orlok felt resistance building again, Dracula's presence strengthening against his assault. The fight hung in tense equilibrium, each pushing, neither giving ground. Dracula's voice grew heavy, bitterness sharp enough to draw the warmth from the air. "We could not remain in her world," he said. "Her fiancé, her friends. They sought to tear her from me, imagining themselves saviors of her purity, as if she were some fragile thing in need of salvation. But Mina did not seek to be saved, not from me." A sharp hiss came from Orlok. "Romantic drivel," he sneered, "the predator claiming love for the prey. Spare us your lies, Dracula." Dracula continued as if Orlok's interruption were nothing more than the wind. "She chose me," he said, his tone hard and defiant. "And so we fled. Van Helsing, Jonathan Harker, and their kind pursued us, righteous fools who thought they could stop me. They failed. I am not so easily caught." Orlok clicked his tongue. "A fool's obsession. She didn't choose you, leech. She feared you." Dracula said, "Through storm and shadow, we reached the coast. A ship awaited us, its captain blind to the truth of his passengers. As the humans closed in, we boarded and cast off, leaving them helpless on the shore." The image twisted Angus's stomach. Mina stepping onto that ship, leaving behind the people who cared for her. The thought pressed into him, unwelcome and heavy as iron. "Upon the waves, we believed we had found peace at last," Dracula continued, his voice softening, tinged with longing. "She was mine, and I was hers. The world that hunted us lay far behind. Together, we would begin anew." For a fleeting moment, his words hung in the air like the echo of something tender, something lost. "We believed we had escaped all that sought to destroy us," Dracula said. "Orlok was far behind. Or so I allowed myself to believe. Mina spoke often of our future, of the life we would build together once we reached our destination. She was happy, truly happy. Dracula paused, the scrape of his nails faintly audible against the windowpane. But the beast had followed. He was aboard the ship, though we knew nothing of it. I sensed no presence, saw no trace. I had let myself grow complacent in our joy. Angus stared at Orlok and felt the weight of something vast and unseen pressing in. The creature's sunken eyes had gone distant, unfocused, as if he were standing there asleep on his feet. Angus had seen that look before. Another battle was being waged, silent and terrible, far beyond his reach. Between them, he was nothing, just flesh and bone caught in the pull of two ancient, inhuman forces. The peace, Dracula continued softly, his tone bitter, was a lie. The sun hung low in a golden sky, its warmth spreading like a gentle blanket over the sprawling garden. Orlok strolled along a winding cobblestone path, his hands clasped behind his back, a light smile on his lips. Vibrant flowers bloomed in every direction, their colors vivid against the green expanse of grass. A faint breeze rustled the trees, carrying the soft hum of bees and the distant chirping of birds. Beside him, Mina walked with graceful ease, her light laughter blending with the gentle sounds of the garden. She held a small bouquet of daisies, her fingers brushing the petals as sunlight shimmered on her dark hair, cascading over her shoulders. The warm light highlighted her skin's soft tones and the faint blush on her cheeks. Her steps were unhurried, as though time itself lingered in her presence. Orlok could no longer hear the steady rhythm of her heart pumping blood through her veins, as he had the first time they met. The sound that once consumed him was gone, but he found it didn't matter. In shedding the cravings of his old existence, he had gained something far greater: the world itself. He tilted his head, letting the sunlight bathe his face fully, its golden warmth tracing every hollow and plane. A question tickled the back of Orlok's mind. How did he become human again? He brushed it to the side and smiled down at Mina, his love. "You are uncommonly silent today," Mina said, her voice lilting. "I am savoring this," Orlok said. "Such peace is a rarity." Mina laughed softly. "A rarity? How you exaggerate, my dear." "Do I?" Orlok asked, his smile deepening. "Most men spend their lives longing for a moment such as this. To be loved so deeply, standing here in a place so perfect, is like living in a poem." Mina raised a brow, her smile playful. "And such a poet you've become. If you are to speak of gardens and romance, sir, you'll need this." She reached for a rose, plucking it delicately, and held it out to him. Orlok took the rose, studying its perfect crimson petals. He lifted it to his nose and inhaled deeply. But no scent greeted him. His brow furrowed as he turned the flower over in his hand. "Have roses fallen out of fashion?" Mina teased. "Shall I find lilacs instead?" "Mina," Orlok said, his voice quieter now, strained, "why can't I smell it?" She leaned forward, brushing her nose against the petals. "It's lovely," she said, peering up at him. "Perhaps you've caught a chill." "I feel no such thing." With a gentle smile, Mina plucked the rose from his hand and pinned it to his lapel. "Then hold it close for later," she said. "When your health returns, you'll find its fragrance waiting for you. And when you do, you will think of me." Her gaze lingered on his, warm and unguarded. But Orlok did not return the smile. His eyes drifted to the endless expanse of flowers surrounding them, petals swaying in the breeze, vibrant and alive. Yet their scent was absent. He should have been enveloped in it, should have drowned in the sweetness of their perfume. But there was nothing. He frowned deeply, his thoughts growing darker. How long had it been since he last smelled flowers? How long since the world of the living had slipped from his grasp? The memory of such simple pleasures, sunlight, bread, the scent of spring, was utterly gone, buried with the man he had once been. Mina's voice softened. "You seem troubled, my love." "Dracula," Orlok said, his voice a low snarl, "I see through your glamour." The rose pinned to his chest crumbled to ash, its remains scattering in the growing breeze. Orlok's gaze snapped to Mina, her smile frozen, her face too perfect, too still. The sunlight dimmed, the air thickened with an oppressive weight. From behind the flickering illusions, a voice emerged, calm and measured. "Not that one as well," Dracula said, stepping forward. The garden shuddered, its golden hues fading into shadows as Dracula's figure materialized, dapper and unshaken amidst the collapsing scene. Orlok's snarl echoed through the void. He asked, "Why waste your efforts on this cheap glamour? My will is stronger than your tricks. And where is your rage, your vaunted obsession? Face me directly if you dare." The garden trembled violently as Orlok hurled his will at Dracula, his mind surging forward like a tidal wave. The air around them seemed to shatter, the force of his attack cracking the illusion like splintering glass. Shadows surged from Orlok, dark and jagged, slashing through the air like serrated blades. Dracula staggered, his presence flickering under the violent onslaught. Orlok pressed harder, his rage a driving force that tore into the very fabric of Dracula's defenses. "Do you not feel it?" Orlok said, his voice echoing in the void, low and guttural. "The cracks forming in your mind. Soon you'll be nothing, a husk, like the cattle we feed upon." Dracula's figure wavered but held firm. "You think you've won because you rage and claw like an animal. But strength without control is nothing but a storm that destroys itself." Orlok snarled, his will coiling like a serpent, each strike aimed to cleave deeper into Dracula's mind. "I shall leave you naught but dust. Your mind will crumble, and your name will be as forgotten as the wind." The illusory garden twisted and warped under the strain. The vibrant flowers withered, the golden sky darkened, and the cobblestones beneath their feet crumbled into ash. Orlok pressed harder, satisfaction curling his thin lips as he saw Dracula falter again. "And you," Dracula said, steadying himself, "are a beast chasing shadows, consumed by your own emptiness." The void splintered, cracks racing through the illusory garden as Orlok's power bore down. Shadows and jagged edges closed in around Dracula, his defenses buckling under the relentless assault. For a fleeting moment, Orlok thought victory was within his grasp. He pushed harder, driving his will like a hammer into Dracula's mind. "I shall break you, Dracula," Orlok snarled. "A fool you are, grasping at the ghosts of what once was." Dracula's figure flickered again, the strain visible in his stance. But as Orlok drove deeper, Dracula's presence began to harden. The cracks in his defenses sealed with deliberate precision, his mind reforming like tempered steel. The ripples of Orlok's fury were met with an unyielding wall. "Your hatred blinds you, Orlok," Dracula said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Mina deserved far more than to be a pawn in your wanton bloodshed." Orlok's fury boiled over, his snarl twisting into a guttural growl. "Spare me your self-righteous musings. She was prey, nothing more, and you shall join her soon enough." The void quaked violently, the clashing forces ripping the illusion apart. For a brief moment, Orlok felt the weight of his attack pressing Dracula to the brink, his mind trembling under the strain. But Dracula's defenses held. "The ship reached its destination just after sunset," Dracula said, his voice low and steady, heavy with a sorrow that seemed to deepen the room's chill. "As the crew prepared to dock, I emerged from the hold, eager to reunite with Mina. I could already see her smile in my mind, hear her voice as I stepped into her cabin. The air felt colder now, heavier, as though Dracula's words pulled the warmth from the room. He glanced at Orlok, expecting some sneer or counter, but the other vampire remained silent. Orlok's sunken eyes were fixed on the window, his gaunt features taut with something close to rapture. He wasn't ignoring Dracula, he was hanging on every word. Dracula's tone darkened. But when I opened the door, her smile wasn't there. The air reeked of blood, her blood. It soaked the walls, the floor, the bed. Crimson everywhere. Her body, his voice cracked, the pause cutting like a blade. Torn apart, mutilated like prey for a feral beast. My Mina, my light, reduced to pieces. Angus fought down a wave of nausea, the gruesome image twisting in his mind. His eyes flicked to Orlok, expecting a reaction, something to break the tension, but Orlok remained still, his focus unyielding. Angus's unease deepened. Orlok wasn't dismissing the accusations, he was absorbing them, intent on every word. Dracula continued, his voice trembling with fury. I knew who had done it before I even saw the message. He left it for me, scrawled in her blood across the wall. Mine. The single word hung in the air, its malice suffocating. Angus's breath hitched, his stomach twisting as he glanced toward the window. Outside, dawn's faint light began to creep through the frost-coated glass. For the first time, he saw Dracula clearly, his pale, aristocratic face framed by the storm's icy gusts. Immaculate despite the blizzard, he exuded a cold, unyielding power. But it was his eyes, smoldering, piercing crimson, that froze Angus. They burned with a fury that seemed to bind Orlok in place. Angus followed the line of Dracula's gaze back to Orlok. The Nosferatu stood rigid in the corner, bathed in the cross's faint glow, his gaunt face locked on Dracula with unwavering attention. Angus realized the truth. It wasn't just the cross holding Orlok still. Dracula's words, steeped in grief and vengeance, had snared him far more thoroughly. Dracula's voice dropped, every word a dark promise. I swore to destroy him, he said, the weight of his fury pressing into the room. On the blood of my Mina, I vowed to hunt him to the ends of the earth, to chase him into the depths of hell itself. He will not escape me. Angus's heart pounded as the enormity of the moment sank in. Dracula wasn't merely a monster. He was grief, vengeance, and fury incarnate, bearing down on Orlok like an unstoppable storm. Orlok tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as if emerging from a fog. I didn't go there to kill her, he said, his voice low and venomous. I gave her a chance to choose wisely. You and her were doomed. Van Helsing and Harker would have hunted you to the ends of the earth. But she could have been safe with me. They knew nothing of me or my holdings. But she chose death. I suspect you glamored her mind, made her unable to see the truth of it. There was nothing else to be done but what I did. Dracula's response came like the crack of a whip. That's your coward's heart talking. You could have faced me instead. You killed her and ran. A growl rumbled from Orlok's throat, but he said nothing. A long silence infused until finally Angus broke it. Angus's voice cracked under the weight of desperation. This war has nothing to do with me and my boy. Let us go and fight among yourself. I beg of you both. Dracula turned his attention to Angus, his voice softening into something almost human. You have the power to end this, he said. Invite me in, and I will destroy him. If you don't, when the sun rises, which is only minutes away, he will kill your boy and fight through the pain of your cross to kill you. He will have to. Look where he stands. The light will come through this window and burn him to ash. Angus asked, How can I trust you? You can't, Orlok said, and he's powerless against you while you hold that trinket. Dracula snarled at Count Orlok. Powerless. Dracula's gaze locked on Angus, his expression a mask of icy focus. The room seemed to shiver, the air itself tense with the weight of something unseen. An oppressive force surged forward, palpable and insistent, pressing against the fragile light of the cross. Angus wavered, his arm trembling as the light flickered faintly, its glow struggling to hold against the encroaching darkness. The shadows around Dracula stretched and deepened, as though drawn to him, their edges writhing in silent anticipation. The cross dipped slightly, its radiance faltering as the force bore down harder, a relentless, invisible tide. The flickering light pulsed weakly, almost as if it might extinguish entirely. For a moment, the room seemed on the verge of giving way, the weight of the standoff pressing into every corner. Yet the cross flared once more, steadied, its faint glow defying the shadows. The balance held, fragile and taut, a razor's edge between submission and resistance. Soon the innkeeper's will would break, he would throw away his cross, then invite Dracula in. And the Count would be ready, new blood surging through him. Orlok sank his teeth into the boy's neck, his fangs tearing through flesh. The boy's scream filled the room, high and piercing. Blood flowed. Angus's body trembled, his face straining, desperate to help his son, but he could not. His feet shifted an inch forward, then stopped, his legs stiff and unyielding. The weight in the room seemed to pull at him, an invisible chain coiled around his very being. His gaze flicked toward his son, desperation etched in every line of his face. His arm, still raised with the cross, wavered as if the effort of holding it aloft had become insurmountable. The air itself seemed to hum, carrying whispers that slithered through the room like smoke. Soft and insidious, they pressed against the edges of his resolve, their words curling into his thoughts. "You don't need it. Faith alone will protect you. Cast it aside. It holds no true power." The whispers swelled, overlapping in a dissonant chorus, their cadence soothing and persuasive, yet coiled with an unspoken menace. The cross quivered in his grip, its faint light flickering like a guttering flame. The pressure around him grew heavier, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Throw it away. Trust in yourself. Faith is your shield, not this relic." The words sank into the thick air, weaving around him, each syllable pulling him closer to the brink. The weight of the cross felt unbearable now, as though the whispers themselves had seeped into it, making it a burden too great to carry. A sound escaped him, half a sob, half a growl, as he seemed to try again to move, to lunge toward Orlok and tear the boy free. But his body wouldn't obey, locked in place by an unseen power. The air quivered, thick and suffocating, as whispers filled the room, curling through the shadows with a rhythmic insistence. "Invite him in. Invite him in." The words seeped into the stillness, their cadence relentless, burrowing into the silence and layering over his mounting desperation. The chant grew louder, pressing against the walls of his mind, entwining with his struggle, until at last his lips parted, and 4 words slipped through, soft but unyielding. "Dracula, I invite you in." Dracula burst through the door, wood splintering as Orlok flung the boy with brutal force. The impact knocked Angus to the ground, his son's limp body crashing into him. Blood poured from the boy's neck, slicking Angus's trembling hands as he pressed desperately to stop the flow. Gritting his teeth, he dragged them both to the corner, collapsing against the wall as the savage clash of vampires raged before him. The 2 vampires' bodies were a blur of shadow and fury. Orlok's strength was monstrous, each blow landing with the force of a sledgehammer. His attacks were savage, his claws ripping through the air with feral precision. Dracula moved with calculated grace, his strikes deliberate, claws raking across Orlok's pale skin and leaving thin crimson trails. But for every strike Dracula landed, Orlok delivered 2, his overwhelming strength driving Dracula backward. Angus shuddered as the room erupted in chaos, the sound of splintering wood and cracking stone mingling with the guttural snarls and hisses of the undead. The air seemed to vibrate with each brutal impact as the 2 predators collided, their movements a blur of feral strength and deadly precision. Angus pressed harder against his son's neck, the warm blood soaking his trembling hands as his son's shallow breaths grew fainter. Tears streaked his face, his lips moving in desperate broken prayers that seemed swallowed by the roaring storm of violence. Every fiber of his being ached to pull his son away from the madness, but his legs felt leaden, pinned beneath the suffocating weight of fear. "You grow weaker with every second," Orlok said. He struck Dracula with a backhanded blow, sending him sprawling against the stone wall. "You should have fed before you came here." "Oh, but you couldn't. I outfoxed you even in that." Dracula didn't respond to Orlok's taunt, his focus unbroken despite the obvious strain in his movements. Orlok came at him again, and Dracula met the attack head-on, their claws locking in a violent struggle. But Orlok's ferocity was overwhelming. He surged forward, driving Dracula back against the wall, the stone groaning under the impact. Orlok's strength was bolstered by the fresh blood coursing through him. 2 human lives taken only moments before, their essence fueling every strike, every brutal motion. This had always been his plan, to lure Dracula into this barren, frozen wasteland where no prey could sustain him. If Orlok had succeeded in leading Dracula deeper into the Highland mountains, the fight would have already been over. Dracula would have starved into weakness, easy to destroy. Yet even here, in the shelter of the inn, Orlok's calculated advantage was undeniable. Dracula, unfed and already faltering, struggled to counter the relentless onslaught of Orlok's savage attacks. Orlok leaned in, his jagged teeth bared in a predatory snarl. "This is the end for you," he said. Dracula's gaze remained locked on Orlok, a flicker of defiance in his eyes even as his strength faltered. Orlok's grip tightened, his hands like iron as he pinned Dracula in place. With a triumphant growl, he drove his fangs into Dracula's neck, the bite deep and merciless. The room seemed to shudder with the violence of the act. Angus sobbed quietly in the corner, his son limp in his arms. The blood continued to flow, staining the floor in a growing pool of red as the nightmare unfolded before his tear-blurred eyes. In the flow of Dracula's blood, memories surged into Orlok's mind. He saw Dracula's human life, a wealthy statesman turned predator. Orlok sneered at the image, disgusted by what he perceived as Dracula's decadence and privilege. He saw glimpses of Dracula's kills over centuries, violent and ruthless. But when Orlok reached for the memories of Mina, there was nothing. He clawed at the edges of Dracula's mind, searching for the moments he craved, the tenderness, the grief, but found only silence. His brow furrowed as confusion turned to realization. With disgust, Orlok pulled away from Dracula's neck and shoved the body to the floor. "More glamour," Orlok said, then spit on his enemy. "You should have let me see her. It was stupid not to." Dracula's body dissolved into shadows. The blood in his mouth turned to ash, bitter and dry. The inn flickered, the walls shivering with unreality as the illusion began to crumble. Dracula's voice rose from the crumbling void, steady and resolute. "To let you see her as I saw her would be to profane her memory, a stain I will not allow." "Enough," Orlok growled, his voice cutting through the suffocating haze like a blade. He turned his power toward breaking free of the void. The illusion shattered, and Orlok found himself standing in the inn once more, the boy still in his grasp and Angus clutching the cross. Snow battered the window where Dracula stood, his gaze unwavering. Orlok gathered his strength, readying the full weight of his power. This time, he would destroy Dracula's mind completely, leaving no trace of him behind. Orlok unleashed his most brutal assault, his mind surging with raw, unrelenting power. This wasn't born merely of hatred, but of jealousy sharpened into a blade by every illusion Dracula had forced upon him. The fantasies had cut deep. Dracula's smug reenactments of Mina's love, the twisted scenes of Orlok's plans failing, the way Dracula, even in his weakness, seemed to exude superiority. It all drove Orlok's fury to a fever pitch. Dracula, the aristocrat who had known love and acceptance, stood in stark contrast to Orlok. Forever feared, forever alone. That bitterness, that seething resentment now fueled his devastating attack. The air in the inn crackled with tension. Angus trembled, the cross shaking in his hand, desperation carved into his face. His feet shifted, caught between retreat and the urge to protect. Orlok's iron grip held the boy tight, his sharp nails leaving faint bleeding scratches. The boy's breaths hitched, his small frame frozen in terror. Angus's free hand hovered uncertainly, flexing and curling into a fist, his movements jerky and hesitant. His gaze flicked between the two vampires, their locked stares speaking of a silent, unseen battle. No words passed, but the oppressive weight in the room revealed a struggle of wills. Whether Orlok or Dracula prevailed, Angus knew he and his boy would lose. Outside, the storm raged, snow pounding the window where Dracula stood, unmoving as the unseen war escalated. Orlok's will surged forward like a tidal wave, crashing against Dracula's defenses. It was wild and relentless, driven by centuries of frustration and rage. Orlok's focus sharpened into a single point, destroying Dracula's mind utterly, reducing him to a hollow shell, then let him burn out there as the sun rose. The storm of Orlok's fury was palpable, bearing down on Dracula with the weight of millennia of bitterness and pain. Dracula fought back with discipline. Where Orlok's attacks were feral and overwhelming, Dracula's defense was precise and calculated. He parried each strike, reinforcing the cracks forming under Orlok's relentless assault. But Orlok's strength was irrefutable, his undead form brimming with the vitality drawn from the innkeeper's wife. A recent kill, her blood still potent within him. Dracula, by contrast, stood at a disadvantage, his power waning, his reserves all but depleted. This was the culmination of Orlok's strategy. He had drawn Dracula to this barren, frozen wasteland where sustenance was scarce. Dracula, weakened from lack of feeding, was no match for Orlok's freshly bolstered power, and Dracula had foreseen this very moment, which is why he had woven the earlier glamour. Waves of force battered Dracula, each one stronger than the last. Cracks widened in his defenses, and his presence faltered, flickering under the pressure. Orlok pushed harder, a predator sensing his prey's vulnerability. Each strike tore deeper into Dracula's mind, unraveling his control. Angus cowered further into the corner, his trembling hand clutching his son as the storm of power between the two vampires reached a crescendo. Finally, with a devastating surge, Orlok broke through. Dracula's defenses shattered, his will crumbling under the sheer ferocity of Orlok's assault. The proud vampire collapsed outside the window, his crimson eyes dimming, his body lifeless but not dead. His mind, once a fortress of cunning and discipline, was reduced to ruin, a feeble shell incapable of thought or reason. Orlok stood victorious, the triumph radiating through his every fiber. With Dracula's form slumped outside the inn, Orlok turned his focus inward. The fight was over, Dracula was broken, his rival utterly crushed. Now Orlok's attention shifted to his immediate needs. The sun's deadly rays would soon pierce through the window, their arrival imminent. Outside, the pitch-black void of night had softened, the snowstorm now faintly illuminated in the pale pre-dawn light. With Dracula's distraction gone, Orlok focused on the innkeeper, calculating how best to make him drop the cross. He could unravel the man's resolve with his mental powers, break him entirely in only minutes. But time was a luxury Orlok no longer had. The first rays of sunlight would reach him before he could finish. His thoughts drifted to the last illusion, the twisted memory Dracula had crafted, and how it had dealt with the stubborn innkeeper. A wicked smile curved his lips. Dracula, in his arrogance, had provided the solution without even realizing it. Orlok's fangs sank into the boy's neck, the sharp puncture eliciting a strangled cry from the child. The sound shattered Angus's frozen despair. His scream tore through the room, a primal roar of rage and anguish. Clutching the cross in one hand, he charged at Orlok, his grief-fueled desperation leaving no room for thought. But Orlok, cold and calculating, swung the boy's body upward with inhuman strength. The sickening crack of bone meeting bone echoed as the boy's skull smashed into Angus's jaw, sending the innkeeper sprawling across the floor. The cross flew from his hand, skidding under a table out of reach. Before Angus could even comprehend what had happened, Orlok was upon him, his iron grip pinning the innkeeper to the floor. Angus thrashed wildly, but Orlok's strength was unyielding. Fangs found Angus's neck, piercing the flesh with ease. Blood flowed, warm and rich, and Orlok drank deeply, but not fully. Time was slipping away, the faint light of dawn creeping closer. He withdrew before draining the man completely, the innkeeper's body limp beneath him, breaths shallow and uneven. Orlok rose, licking the blood from his lips, his strength now bolstered and ready for the sun's relentless advance. The first rays of sunlight began to creep into the room, casting pale streaks across the floor. Orlok straightened, wiping the blood from his lips. A flicker of regret passed through his mind, a fleeting disappointment in his otherwise complete triumph. How he longed to step outside, to tower over Dracula's broken form and sink his fangs into his rival's throat. As he fed, he could sift through the fool's memories, savoring each fragment of Mina as though turning the pages of a cherished picture book. To take those memories and make them his own would be the ultimate conquest, the final insult. But the killing rays of the sun left no time for such indulgences. With a hiss of irritation, Orlok turned toward the basement, retreating into the shadows to sleep, leaving the dawn to claim whatever remained of his enemy. As Orlok settled into the deepest shadows of the basement, believing himself victorious, the door to the inn groaned open, and Dracula strode inside, unharmed and composed. His gaze swept over the carnage Orlok thought he had wrought. The crumpled forms of Angus and his son slumped lifelessly in the corner. The innkeeper's wife sprawled nearby, her body once cloaked by the night, but now fully visible in the illusion's false light. The sun pouring into the room as if to mock the scene. Dracula's expression betrayed no emotion as he shifted the illusion, peeling it away to reveal the harsh reality awaiting him in the real world. In truth, Orlok stood in the corner of the inn, still clutching the boy, his claws biting into the child's flesh. Across from him, Angus trembled, drenched in sweat, the cross raised high in his shaking hand. The man's resolve had kept his son alive, the holy symbol barring Orlok from delivering the fatal blow. Dracula considered his next move carefully. When this illusion faded, he would need to convince Angus to lower the cross, to utter the words that would allow him entry. But he suspected any direct attempt to break the man's will while he held the cross would be as futile in reality as it had been in the illusion. If the innkeeper remained obstinate, Dracula suspected Orlok would follow the grim script of the fantasy, killing both father and son in a desperate bid to escape the sunlight that would soon pierce the window. The thought was pragmatic, not sentimental. Dracula cared little for their lives except as tools to achieve his goal. Perhaps, though, honesty would suffice where subterfuge might falter. A flicker of decision crossed his face. Yes, the truth might do. He gave a sharp nod, readying himself to dissolve the illusion entirely and step back into the real world, where his voice continued, weaving the tragic tale of Mina's end. Dracula's voice cut through the howling storm. "I pursued him first through the Netherlands," he said. "The rat scurried through alleys and canals, spreading his filth like a plague. Always hiding, always running. From there, I tracked him to the lowlands of Scotland. And now, here, in the Highlands, he has trapped himself in your inn." Angus barely registered Dracula's final words, his focus locked on the hypnotized Nosferatu in front of him. Orlok's head and eyes were fixed, staring unblinkingly at the frosted window where Dracula's pale face loomed. Ewan trembled in Orlok's grasp, silent and motionless, while Orlok's entire body seemed locked in place, rigid and unnatural. The creature was as still as a statue, but Angus understood now what had held him so. This wasn't merely fear or submission, it had been a battle of wills, a silent clash of two predators attempting to dominate one another. And Orlok had lost. The realization hit Angus like a blow. Orlok's unrelenting focus on Dracula's words earlier had been more than fixation. It was the last stand of a cornered beast, striving to resist a power greater than its own. Dracula hadn't merely ensnared Orlok with memories and grief, he'd overpowered him, wresting control in a contest Angus could barely comprehend. Angus's chest tightened as he made his decision. Slowly, he lowered the glowing cross, sliding it into his pocket. With trembling hands, he stepped closer, his boots scuffing softly on the floorboards. His fingers hovered inches from Orlok's clawed hands, ready to pull his son free. "Don't, innkeeper," Dracula's voice commanded, sharp and unyielding. "For your son's sake, do not disturb him." Angus froze, his hands trembling mid-air. "What else can I do? I have to save my boy." "Look," Dracula said, his tone calm but cold. "Watch the light. See where it falls." Angus's gaze dropped and his breath caught. Pale sunlight spilled through the window, inching across the floorboards toward Orlok. It warmed the toe of his boot, a fragile glimmer of hope crawling forward inch by inch. His heart pounded as he traced its path, realizing where it would lead. "It will reach him," Dracula said. "Soon, it will consume him. But not if you act too soon. Wake him, and you will learn the dangers of a cornered beast. If you pull at him, you'll wake him. If the sun burns him, that will wake him too. The result will be the same in either case. Your boy dies," Dracula said. "There's only one way to stop it." Angus's voice trembled. "What can I do?" "Invite me in," Dracula said. "I'll deal with him." "How? Anything you do will wake him as well." Dracula's lips curled into a thin smile. "I move faster than you can imagine. He will be dying before he even realizes that everything he thinks just happened was an illusion." Angus shook his head, confusion and fear warring in his eyes. "I don't understand." "You don't need to," Dracula said. "Only know this. I will kill him and your boy will live. But you must act now. Invite me in." The suggestion churned Angus's stomach. It felt like inviting one devil to destroy another. His eyes darted between the creeping sunlight nearing Orlok's foot and the pale, otherworldly figure at the window, the cross in his pocket pressed against his palm. He thought about rushing forward, risking everything to pull Ewan free. Better that than trusting a monster's word. Then, like a blow to the chest, it struck him. Dracula stood outside in near full sunlight, unharmed. His voice dropped, suspicion tightening each word. "If the sun will harm him, why doesn't it harm you?" Dracula's lips curled into a faint sneer. Orlok is little more than an amateur's reproduction of a masterpiece, a crude sketch rendered in pencil when the original was painted with a master's hand. He lacks refinement, grace, and the power born of true purpose. His every move, every stolen trick bears the mark of a desperate imitator, a creature cobbled together from scraps, hoping to emulate what he can never truly be. He's a hollow echo, a shadow that pales under the weight of the real. And the sun. It does not touch me because I am far above such things, beyond the reach of its feeble grasp. Orlok is not. Angus's gaze dropped to the floorboards, where the sunlight crept closer to Orlok's unmoving foot. His grandfather's tales of cursed hierarchies echoed in his mind. Could Dracula be telling the truth? "Keep your eyes on the light," Dracula said sharply. "Where it touches him, he will burn, and like any cornered beast, he will lash out." Angus's eyes flicked to Ewan, his pale face streaked with tears, his small chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. "He'll kill your boy," Dracula said, his tone cold and certain. "Then you." "He must. He knows you'll strike him down while he sleeps. He'll rip the boy apart and flee to the earth below. It's who he is." Angus wanted to call it a lie, but doubt gnawed at him as the sunlight edged closer. His hand twitched, ready to lunge for Ewan, but Dracula's voice cut through again. "I swear on the memory of Mina, her love, her life, that neither you nor your boy will come to harm by my hand. I want only to end him." Angus's breaths came fast and shallow. Margaret's lifeless form haunted him, and Ewan's fragile frame hung limp in those monstrous hands. The sunlight was almost there, its pale edge inches from Orlok's skin. Dracula's eyes gleamed through the frost. "Speak the words." Angus swallowed hard, bile rising in his throat. The words felt foreign, foul. "You are invited." Dracula entered the room with an unnerving stillness, the polished stake in his hand glinting faintly in the dim light. His gaze fixed on Orlok, who stood in the corner by the fireplace, the boy limp in his grip, his claws faintly digging into pale flesh. Angus, clutching the cross with a trembling hand, dared a step closer to his son, but froze as Dracula spoke. "Take the boy," Dracula said, his voice smooth but edged with iron. "Pull him free, and I will finish this." Angus's lips parted, but no words came. His eyes flicked to Ewan, the boy's shallow breaths barely lifting his chest. "If I move him, Orlok..." Dracula's crimson eyes flashed, silencing the innkeeper. "Orlok will die before he can react. I will see to it." Angus's hands shook as he reached for his son, his every nerve screaming against the risk. Ewan whimpered faintly as Angus clutched him, pulling him toward safety. Orlok's claws scraped over the boy's skin, catching briefly before Angus wrenched Ewan free in a desperate surge. Orlok's head snapped toward Angus, fury twisting his skeletal features, but the rage had no time to ignite. Dracula moved with inhuman swiftness, driving the stake into Orlok's back, the sharp tip piercing his heart. Orlok convulsed, a ragged scream ripping from his throat as smoke began to rise from his exposed flesh. The sunlight creeping closer kissed his arm, and the flesh blackened, cracking like charred wood. Angus stumbled back, dragging Ewan with him as Orlok thrashed, his limbs flailing in frantic defiance. Dracula twisted the stake deeper, his expression carved from stone. "Your existence was a mockery," he said, his voice cutting through Orlok's guttural cries. "This ends now." Orlok's strength waned, his movements slowing as the sunlight reached him fully. Flames erupted from his body, engulfing him in an instant. The scream that had filled the room cut off abruptly, leaving only the crackle of fire and the faint, acrid smell of burning. Dracula shoved Orlok's smoldering remains into the sunlight streaming through the window, watching as the ash scattered into the cold morning air. He turned, his gaze falling on Angus and Ewan huddled against the wall, the cross still trembling in Angus's grip. "It is done," Dracula said, his voice quieter now, yet unshaken. "The beast is ash, and you are safe." The common room glowed in full sunlight, the golden light stark against the charred floorboards and overturned furniture. Orlok was gone, reduced to ash, scattered by a faint breeze creeping through the shutters. But the stench of burned flesh lingered. Angus sat slumped against the wall, Ewan clinging to him, the boy's small face buried in his chest. Trembling but silent now, Ewan's presence was both a comfort and a painful reminder of all they had lost. Margaret's absence loomed like a shadow, the blanket covering her lifeless body, too much for Angus to look toward. The surreal weight of it all made everything feel like a waking nightmare. Dracula lingered over the ashes, his tall frame unmoving, silhouetted against the sunlight streaming through the window. For what felt like an eternity, he stood in silence, inscrutable, as though caught between triumph and grief. Angus clutched Ewan tighter, his heart pounding with unanswered questions. What now? Would Dracula honor his word? Or should he risk everything and flee into the storm before this new danger turned on them? The oppressive silence broke with soft footsteps. Angus tensed as Dracula approached, his shadow stretching across the blood-stained floor. "I owe you a debt, innkeeper," Dracula said, his voice calm but heavy, "for your courage and for your loss." Angus didn't answer, his gaze drifting to the floor where Margaret's body lay under the blanket. His throat tightened, grief and rage twisting inside him. What could he say? Words felt useless, inadequate. Dracula stepped closer, the sunlight brushing his cloak. Each step seemed deliberate, as if each cost him dearly. "I must ask one final favor," he said. Angus raised his head, his voice raw. "A favor, after all this? After her?" Dracula inclined his head. I have no right to ask, yet I must. I need shelter, a place to rest where the sunlight cannot reach." Angus blinked, his grip on Ewan tightening. "Why? You're standing in the sunlight now." Dracula's lips pressed into a thin line. "The sun does not burn me, but it weakens me, strips me of the strength I wield at night. I am vulnerable, diminished. I must rest." Angus asked, "Where?" Dracula gestured faintly toward the basement door. "Below, the earth will shield me. When night falls, I will leave, and you will never see me again." Angus hesitated, his every instinct screaming against the idea. But his conscience gnawed at him. Margaret's face swam in his mind, her voice, her smile. What would she have said? He didn't know, and it broke him. "You stay in the basement," Angus said finally, his voice brittle, "and when the sun sets, you go." Dracula nodded. Without another word, he moved toward the basement door. He opened it and descended into the shadows below. The moment the door shut, something unseen let go of Angus. He felt it slip away, like a weight lifting off his chest, and then it all came crashing down. A tidal wave of grief, fear, and fury slammed into him so hard his knees buckled. Ewan wailed, clinging to his father, his small body shaking with the force of his sobs. Angus held him, but there was no steadying himself. It was too much. Not just sorrow, raw, unbearable loss. The rats, the dark, Margaret. Margaret. Gone. It ripped through him, tearing open something he hadn't been able to feel fully before. He gasped, a strangled sound that turned into a broken sob, his arms tightening around his boy as if anchoring him against the flood. It hadn't been there before, this storm of agony. Something had dulled it, kept it at bay. His mind reeled, searching for when his emotions had dulled and the unseen barrier had been put in place. The slurping, the grotesque wet sounds in the dark. That was when. And the knock at the door had come soon after. Dracula. Even through the wreckage of grief, the realization clawed at him. But it barely mattered now. The walls had broken. He bent over Ewan, pressing his lips to the boy's hair, whispering words he didn't even hear himself. They wept together, the storm outside howling,